My wife ridiculed my tattered leather notebook at an elite charity gala. I kept my mouth shut. 3 hours later, a retired federal judge noticed the faded emblem on its cover and instantly turned ashen. "Where did you uncover this?" he demanded, and when I gave him my mother's name, he stumbled backward in pure shock before muttering, "They have absolutely no idea what you possess." The gala was her obsession for 6 months. It was a philanthropic auction at the Boston Harbor Hotel, crawling with commercial real estate developers she desperately wanted to court. She spent the weekend agonizing over her wardrobe, eventually dropping a staggering amount on a midnight blue silk gown and booking a professional makeup artist. I wore my standard charcoal suit and slipped my mother's old leather notebook into my inner breast pocket. I have severe social anxiety, and keeping my hands busy by sketching or taking notes is my only reliable coping mechanism. That became her primary grievance for the night. She spotted the frayed edges of the binding sticking out of my pocket while we were still waiting for our Uber at 6:15 p.m. "You are not dragging that filthy thing in there," she declared. I told her it was my anxiety anchor, a fact she was intimately familiar with, but she rolled her eyes in disgust. She didn't speak another word to me for the entire ride, weaponizing her silence exactly the way she always did. The ballroom was intimidating. Vaulted ceilings, massive centerpieces, waiters floating past with champagne trays. We were seated at table 14 with two of her firm's senior managing partners, Thomas and Patricia. The conversation flowed easily enough at first. I stayed quiet, occasionally reaching into my pocket to touch the familiar leather binding. Then, as the waitstaff began clearing the salad plates, my wife decided to make me her punchline. I had placed the notebook on my lap, but she reached over, snatched it, and tossed it onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Look at what my husband insists on carrying to a black tie event," she announced to Thomas and Patricia, wearing a venomous smile. I keep telling him it looks like he dug it out of a dumpster behind a thrift store, but he clings to it like a toddler with a security blanket. Thomas barked out a patronizing laugh, while Patricia offered a thin smile of pity. I calmly retrieved the notebook and slid it back into my pocket. My mother had been a paralegal for a mid-sized firm in Chicago. She was fiercely intelligent, working 80-hour weeks to keep us afloat, quietly doing the grueling background work while the attorneys took all the credit. She passed away from pancreatic cancer when I was 28. That notebook was the only personal belonging of hers I had kept. I cherished it because the pages still faintly smelled of her favorite vanilla coffee. My wife knew exactly what it meant to me, yet she had never once respected it. During the speeches, I noticed the older gentleman at the adjacent table. He was in his late 70s, wearing a bespoke tuxedo, radiating a quiet grace. When Thomas and Patricia visited the open bar at 8:30 p.m., the gentleman approached our table, bypassing pleasantries entirely. He stopped beside my chair, staring down at the leather spine of my notebook. "May I examine that binding?" he asked, his voice rough and commanding. I looked at my wife. Her jaw was practically resting on the floor. I handed the book over. The man didn't open it. Instead, he flipped it to the back cover and ran his thumb over a faded, blind-stamped crest I had always assumed was just a generic manufacturer's logo. His breath hitched. He looked at me with terrifying intensity. "Who did this belong to?" I told him my mother's name and her old profession. The man closed his eyes, gripping the table edge so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Your mother," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "was the anonymous whistleblower who broke the Harrison corporate embezzlement ring in 2004. He slid the notebook back toward me with trembling hands. She vanished before the settlement was distributed. This emblem proves this book contains the cipher key to the plaintiff's escrow account. There is over $9 million sitting untouched in a federal trust, waiting for her sole heir to claim it." He pulled a gold-embossed business card from his breast pocket and laid it on top of the worn leather. "Call my private chambers tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I pocketed the notebook and the card. My wife was staring at me, her face completely pale, her previous arrogance shattered. When Thomas and Patricia finally returned, asking if we wanted after-dinner drinks, I stood up and pushed my chair in. "No," I said, looking right past her. "I'm heading home." At 9:03 the next morning, I called the number on the card. A different voice answered, one that wasn't the judge's, and said only, "He's been trying to reach you all night. You need to come in now." I didn't ask questions. I just wrote down the address he gave me. It wasn't a courthouse or a towering downtown skyscraper like I had expected. It was a renovated brownstone in Brookline, wedged quietly between a pediatric dentist and a boutique dry cleaner. A small brass plaque next to the heavy oak door simply read Locke and Ives Arbitration. My wife Coralie was still asleep in the guest bedroom when I left. She had come home hours after I did the night before, slamming the front door and stomping down the hallway in a silent rage. I knew the fight was coming, but I didn't have the capacity for it yet. The notebook was heavy in my jacket pocket, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I buzzed the intercom and was immediately buzzed in. The interior smelled of old paper and lemon polish. A young man with dark circles under his eyes was waiting in the small reception area. He looked to be in his late 20s, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt without a tie, clutching a thick manila folder. "I'm Caden," he said, extending a hand. He had the distinct, exhausted look of a junior clerk who hadn't slept in 48 hours. "Judge Locke is waiting in the back." He led me down a narrow hallway, lined with bankers' boxes. The further we walked, the more I felt a strange knot tightening in my stomach. I had grown up watching my mother, Vida, haul boxes exactly like these into our tiny apartment, working late into the night under a flickering kitchen light. Jasper Locke was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, looking far older and far more fragile in the morning light than he had in his tuxedo the night before. He didn't stand when I walked in. He just gestured to a leather chair opposite him. "Sit," he said, his voice stripped of the previous night's dramatic urgency. It was just tired now. Heavy. Caden placed the folder on the desk and stepped back, hovering near the doorway. "I apologize for the dramatics last night," Locke began, lacing his fingers together over the desk. "But when I saw that crest, 20 years of dead ends suddenly materialized in front of me. I needed you out of that room, away from those people, as quickly as possible." I pulled a notebook from my pocket and placed it on his desk. "You said there's a federal trust. You said my mother was a whistleblower. Vida never talked about her work. She was just a paralegal." "Vida was brilliant," Locke corrected quietly. "She wasn't just doing administrative work. She was the only person at her firm who noticed the routing discrepancies in the Harrison real estate acquisitions. When she brought it to her managing partners, they told her to drop it. So, she came to me. I was a sitting federal judge at the time, handling the initial bankruptcy filings for a shell company tied to Harrison." He reached out and gently touched the cover of the notebook. "She mapped the entire embezzlement network by hand. She used this book because she knew her digital footprint at the firm was being monitored. When the Department of Justice finally moved in, the Harrison partners managed to stall the asset forfeiture. They tied tied the stolen funds up in a blind trust, hoping to bleed the plaintiffs dry in court over the next decade. The only way to unlock the trust and distribute the settlement was a specific alphanumeric cipher tied to the original ledger, which is in here, I said, staring at the worn leather. Yes, but your mother passed before the final judgments were issued. The DOJ couldn't locate the physical ledger, and Vita was terrified for you. She kept her identity as the informant entirely sealed. Legally, the whistleblower reward, a percentage of the recovered funds, belongs to her estate, to you, $9 million. I sat back in the chair. The number felt abstract, meaningless. I thought of the years Vita spent coughing, the medical bills we couldn't pay, the way she rationed her pain medication because the insurance wouldn't cover the full prescription. $9 million. It made me sick. How do I claim it? I asked, my voice flat. Locke exchanged a look with Caden. Caden stepped forward, pulling a document from the folder. That's the problem, Caden said, his voice careful. To claim the funds, we have to file a formal petition to unseal the trust. The moment we do that, a notification is sent to the current legal representatives of the Harrison estate. They will immediately file an injunction. They've been waiting for the cipher to surface so they can argue it was obtained illegally and claim the funds for themselves. They're a corporate entity, Locke added. They have bottomless pockets and a terrifying legal team. They will drag you through depositions, they will audit your entire life, and they will try to break you financially before you ever see a dime. So I just walk away? I asked. No, Locke said sharply. You fight them, but you need to know exactly who you're fighting before you authorize me to file the petition. He slid the document across the desk toward me. It was a standard legal filing, thick with dense paragraphs, but Locke had highlighted a single section at the bottom of the first page. Lead counsel for the Harrison successor entity. I stared at the name of the firm. It was Corley's firm. The knot in my stomach tightened into a hard, cold rock. They absorbed the Harrison defense team 6 years ago. Caden explained softly. The partners at your wife's firm are the exact same people your mother was investigating 20 years ago. I thought back to the gala, to table 14, to Thomas, the senior managing partner, barking out a patronizing laugh as Corley threw my mother's notebook onto the tablecloth. Thomas, I breathed. Thomas Quill, Locke confirmed, his eyes locking onto mine. He was a junior associate at Harrison in 2004. He was the one who signed off on the fraudulent routing numbers. Your mother was the one who caught him. He dodged indictment by throwing his senior partners under the bus, and he spent the last 2 decades climbing the ladder at his new firm. I looked down at the notebook, the faded cover, the edges frayed from years of being shoved into my pockets, my only comfort in rooms where I felt small and useless. My wife had practically served it to him on a silver platter. If we file this petition, I said slowly, tracing the edge of the desk, my wife's firm will be legally notified. Within 24 hours, Locke said. And because you are married to one of their mid-level associates, Quill will instantly claim a conflict of interest. He will argue that you and your wife colluded to extort the firm. He will try to disbar her, and he will use the marriage to invalidate your claim to the estate. She didn't know, I said automatically. Corley had no idea. She hates this notebook. It doesn't matter what she knew, Locke said, his tone softening with a grim reality. What matters is how it looks on paper. The moment I file this, your household becomes a war zone. You cannot tell her about the money. You cannot tell her about Quill. If she mentions it at the office, even passingly, Quill will know we are coming before we have the legal barricades in place. I stood up. I took the notebook from the desk and slid it back into my breast pocket. The weight of it felt entirely different now. It wasn't just a memory of my mother anymore. It was a live grenade. Draw up the petition, I said. Locke nodded slowly. We need 3 days to build a protective trust structure for you before we file. Do not alter your routine. Go to work. Go home. Do not engage with your wife about the gala. I left the brownstone and walked out into the brisk Boston morning. The drive back to the apartment felt like a blur. I parked my car, took a deep breath, and unlocked the front door. Corley was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a mug of coffee. She was still wearing the sweatpants she slept in, her makeup from last night completely washed away, leaving her looking pale and sharp. She didn't look up when I walked in. She just stared at her mug. You embarrassed me, she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. You just stood up and left me there with Thomas and Patricia. Do you have any idea what that looked like? Thomas asked if you were having a mental breakdown. I walked to the sink and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were remarkably steady. I was tired, Corley. I wanted to go home. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes narrowing. Don't play stupid. I saw the way that old man looked at your stupid little book. I saw the business card he gave you. Patricia recognized him. Jasper Locke. He's a retired federal judge who handles high net worth arbitration. She stood up, walking slowly toward me. The anger in her voice was suddenly laced with a sharp, calculating curiosity. What did he say to you? She demanded. Why did a federal judge care about your mother's thrift store diary? It was nothing, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. He recognized the manufacturer's crest, said it was a rare binding, an antique thing. Corley stopped a few feet away from me. She crossed her arms, her gaze dropping to the breast pocket of my jacket where the notebook was hidden. She didn't believe a word I said. I could see the gears turning in her head, calculating the sudden shift in power, weighing the humiliation of the previous night against the sudden, glittering potential of a retired federal judge taking an interest in her husband. You're lying, she said quietly. Thomas wants to see us in his office tomorrow morning, both of us. He said there was something about last night that didn't sit right with him, and he wants to clear the air regarding your sudden departure. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I didn't break eye contact. Thomas didn't want to clear the air. Thomas wanted to know exactly what Jasper Locke had been looking at on table 14. I'm not going, I said. Yes, you are, Corley snapped, taking a step closer, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. My promotion is on the line. I am not letting your social anxiety ruin my career. You are going to sit in that office, you are going to apologize to Thomas, and you are going to tell him exactly what Jasper Locke wanted with you. She turned on her heel and stormed back toward the bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I reached into my pocket and touched the rough leather of the notebook. 3 days, Locke had said. I just had to survive 3 days. Monday morning arrived with the kind of suffocating silence that usually precedes a divorce. Corley didn't make coffee. She just dressed in her sharpest charcoal suit, grabbed her keys, and waited by the front door. We drove to her firm in separate cars, which was her idea. She wanted to make sure she could stay late to do damage control, and she made it very clear she didn't want me lingering in the lobby afterward. Her firm occupied the top 3 floors of a glass and steel monolith in the financial district. I had only been there twice before, both times for mandatory holiday parties where I stood near the catering tables and tried not to sweat through my shirt. Today, the sterile white hallways felt like a hospital ward. Corley led me past rows of cubicles and frosted glass doors until we reached the corner office. Thomas Quill's name was etched into a brushed steel plaque. When we walked in, Thomas was sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk that looked identical to the one in Locke's brownstone, just newer and significantly more expensive. Patricia was there too, sitting on a leather sofa in the corner, holding an iPad. They both looked up. "Have a seat," Thomas said. He didn't offer to shake my hand. Coralie sat in one of the sleek visitor chairs. I took the other. I kept my hands folded in my lap, deliberately avoiding the instinct to reach for my breast pocket. The notebook was at home, hidden inside a hollowed-out stack of winter sweaters in the back of my closet. I wasn't going to bring it into the lion's den. "I appreciate you both coming in so early," Thomas began, his voice dripping with that same patronizing warmth he'd used at the gala. "Coralie, you know how highly we value you here. You're on the partner track. You're doing phenomenal work, but this firm operates on discretion and cohesion. And Saturday night, well, it was disruptive. Thomas, I am so sorry," Coralie started, leaning forward, her voice tight with desperation. "I had no idea he was going to walk out like that. It was incredibly unprofessional. I'm less concerned about the exit, Coralie," Thomas interrupted, raising a single manicured hand. "I'm more interested in what precipitated it." He shifted his gaze to me. His eyes were cold, calculating. There was no trace of the laughing man from the auction. "You had a rather intense conversation with Jasper Locke. That's not a man who typically mingles at these events. What were you two discussing?" I looked down at my hands. I let my natural anxiety take over. I let my shoulders hunch. I let my breathing get a little shallower. It wasn't hard. The fear of what Thomas had done to my mother, of what he represented, was entirely real. He liked my notebook," I mumbled, staring at my knuckles. "Your notebook," Thomas repeated, his tone flat. Patricia stopped typing on her iPad and looked over at us. "Yes, he collects antique legal bindings," I lied. The lie felt incredibly heavy on my tongue, but I kept my voice small and pathetic. "He saw the stamp on the back cover. He said it looked like it was from a specific bindery in Boston from the late 80s. He just wanted to look at it." Thomas stared at me for a long time. I could feel Coralie burning a hole into the side of my head with her glare. "A bindery," Thomas said slowly. "Yes," I said, finally looking up at him. I widened my eyes just a fraction. He gave me his card and said if I ever wanted to sell it, I should call his office. That's all. I was just really overwhelmed by the crowds, so I went home. Patricia let out a soft, dismissive sigh from the corner. "Jesus, Thomas, Locke is known for being an eccentric collector. He spent $80,000 on a set of vintage gavels last year at a Sotheby's auction." The tension in Thomas's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. He looked at me, dissecting my posture, my cheap suit, my nervous hands. He didn't see a threat. He saw the pathetic, socially inept husband of his rising star associate. He saw exactly what Coralie had trained him to see. "I see," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "Well, next time, try to handle your social fatigue with a bit more grace. You represent this firm by extension when you attend our tables." "I will," I said softly. "I'm sorry." "You can go," Thomas told me, dismissing me like a mildly annoying intern. "Coralie, stay. We need to go over the quarterly filings for the retail trust." I stood up, walked out of the office, and didn't take a full breath until I was in the elevator and the doors closed. I leaned against the back wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Day one hurdle cleared. I went to my own job. I work inventory management for a regional restaurant supply chain. It's quiet, methodical work. Normally, I find comfort in the spreadsheets and the predictable rhythm of shipments and invoices. Today, the numbers on the screen were just a blur. I kept waiting for my phone to ring. At 2:15 p.m., it did. It was an unknown number, but I recognized the Boston area code. I stepped out of the warehouse and into the alley out back before answering. "Hello, it's Caden," the voice said. He sounded even more exhausted than he had yesterday. "Judge Locke wanted me to give you an update. We have a problem." I leaned against the brick wall. "What kind of problem?" "The protective trust structure requires rigorous identity verification to bypass the standard probate delays," Caden explained, his voice low. "Because your mother's identity as a federal informant was sealed. We have to prove a direct, unassailable chain of inheritance before we file the petition. Otherwise, Quill's firm will instantly file a motion to dismiss based on lack of standing, and they'll drag the inheritance through a dozen different courts until you run out of money." "So what do you need?" I asked. "We need her original death certificate. Not a copy, not a scan. The state issued original with the raised seal. And we need the original birth certificate naming you as her son." I know it sounds pedantic, but when you're dealing with a $9 million blind trust, Quill's team will weaponize a missing staple if they think it'll buy them time. My stomach dropped. "I don't have them." Caden paused. "You don't have your own birth certificate?" "I do, but I don't physically have it," I said, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "When Coralie and I got married, she consolidated all our important documents. Passports, social security cards, birth certificates, deeds. She put them in a fireproof lockbox." "Okay," Caden said. "So go get them." "You don't understand," I said. "The lockbox is in her home office. She keeps it locked, and the only key is on her personal keyring. She never takes it off." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. A delivery truck rattled past the alley, kicking up a cloud of dusty city air. "Judge Locke wants this petition filed by Thursday morning," Caden said finally. "If we miss that window, the federal docket closes for a 2-week judicial recess, and Quill might hear rumors from his network before we can secure your position. You need to get into that box." "I'll figure it out," I told him, and hung up. I left work early and went straight home. I needed to understand the logistics of what I was about to do. I walked into Coralie's home office. It was immaculate. Everything had a place. Her law school diploma hung perfectly centered above her desk. The fireproof lockbox was tucked onto the bottom shelf of a built-in bookcase, heavy and gray. I knelt down and examined the lock. It wasn't a standard cheap dial. It was a high-security tubular lock. Picking it wasn't an option. Not that I even knew how. I needed her keys. Coralie came home around 7 p.m. I heard the front door open, followed by the familiar clatter of her dropping her purse on the entryway table, and then the distinct, heavy jingle of her keys hitting the wooden bowl next to it. She walked into the kitchen, kicked off her heels, and poured herself a glass of wine. She looked exhausted, but the frantic, dangerous energy from the morning was gone. "Thomas was satisfied," she announced to the room, not really looking at me. "He thinks you're just weird." I had to spend 45 minutes assuring him it wouldn't happen again, but he's dropping it. He even gave me the lead on the new retail acquisition. "That's great, Coralie," I said, chopping vegetables at the island. "I'm glad it worked out." She took a long sip of her wine, eyeing me over the rim of the glass. "Don't ever pull a stunt like that again. I mean it. You humiliated me, and then you made me lie for you." "I know," I said softly. "It won't happen again." She set the glass down. "I'm taking a shower. Order Thai food. I don't want to cook." She walked down the hallway, and a minute later, I heard the bathroom door click shut. The water turned on. I set the knife down. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them flat against the granite countertop for a few seconds to steady myself. I walked quietly to the entryway. The wooden bowl sat under the hall mirror. Her keyring was buried under a stack of unopened mail. I pulled it out. It was heavy, weighed down by her car fob, her office swipe card, our apartment key, and 3 smaller keys. I knew the silver, tubular one was for the lockbox. I had maybe 10 minutes before she finished her shower and started her evening routine. I moved down the hall, avoiding the creaky floorboard near the guest bedroom, and slipped into her office. I knelt in front of the bookcase, slid the silver key into the tubular lock, and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a heavy, satisfying thud. I pulled the lid open. Inside were neat, labeled manila folders, passports, taxes, insurance. I flipped past them until I found the folder labeled vital records. I pulled it out and opened it. My birth certificate was right there on top. Beneath it was my mother's original death certificate, the raised seal, completely intact. I pulled them both out and folded them carefully, slipping them into my back pocket. I was about to close the folder when another document caught my eye. It was tucked underneath our marriage license. It wasn't an official state document. It was a printed email folded in half. I shouldn't have looked. I should have locked the box, put the key back, and gone to the kitchen. But the sender's name at the top of the page was Thomas Quill. I pulled the paper out and unfolded it. To Coralie from Thomas Quill, date October 12, 2024. Subject: the husband problem. I stared at the date. It was from a year and a half ago, long before the gala, long before any of this. Coralie, as we discussed at lunch, the partnership track requires absolute alignment in both professional and personal spheres. I understand your hesitation, but dead weight is dead weight. If you want the senior associate spot by Q3, you need to finalize the separation. I've already spoken to Patricia, and she agrees. Cut him loose before he drags your social equity down any further. We can recommend a quiet divorce attorney who handles firm matters. Beneath it was Coralie's reply. Thomas, I appreciate the guidance. I'm laying the groundwork now. I just need to make sure the timing doesn't interfere with the annual bonus structure. Give me until the end of the year. I'll handle him. I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the walls had rushed in to crush my lungs. She wasn't just embarrassed by me. She had been actively planning to discard me for over a year, coordinating it with the exact man who had ruined my mother's life. The water in the bathroom suddenly shut off. Panic spiked in my chest. I shoved the email back into the folder, tossed the folder into the lockbox, and slammed the lid down. I turned the key, pulled it out, and stood up so fast a wave of dizziness hit me. I walked out of the office, down the hall, and dropped the keys back into the wooden bowl just as the bathroom door swung open. A cloud of steam rolled out, and Coralie stepped into the hallway. Wrapped in a white towel, rubbing her wet hair, she stopped. She looked at me standing awkwardly in the hallway, then looked down at the wooden bowl. What are you doing? She asked, her voice instantly sharp. I was looking for the mail, I lied, my voice cracking slightly. I thought a package came today. She narrowed her eyes, stepping closer to the entryway. She reached into the bowl and picked up her keys. She didn't look at the lockbox key specifically, but she held the heavy ring in her hand, testing its weight, her eyes fixed entirely on my face. Did you order the food? She asked slowly. I'm doing it right now, I said, backing away toward the kitchen. Good, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, because Thomas wants us at a firm dinner on Wednesday night, just the 3 of us. He said he wants to formally move past the weekend, Wednesday night, the night before Locke was supposed to file the petition. I'll be there, I said, feeling the stiff, folded death certificate pressing against my skin, in my back pocket. You'd better be, she said, turning toward the bedroom, and wear a different suit. I stood in the hallway listening to our bedroom door click shut. The damp heat from her shower was still clinging to the air, but I felt freezing cold. I reached around and touched my back pocket, feeling the stiff, folded edges of the state-issued paper through the fabric of my jeans, my mother's death certificate, my birth certificate, and the ghost of an email burned into the back of my eyelids. Cut him loose before he drags your social equity down any further. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the far edge of the mattress, listening to Coralie's steady, rhythmic breathing in the dark. Every time she shifted, my heart spiked. I kept my jeans folded on the floor right next to my side of the bed, terrified she might wake up in the middle of the night and decide to check my pockets for some reason. It was an irrational fear, but nothing felt rational anymore. The woman I had been married to for 4 years was a stranger, worse than a stranger. She was an operative for the very people who had bled my mother dry. Tuesday morning was a masterclass in dissociation. We went through our standard routine: coffee, silence, the clatter of her keys. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the underground garage before I grabbed my jacket and left. I didn't go to the warehouse. I called in sick, citing a migraine, and took the green line straight to Brooklyn. Caden was waiting in the reception area of Lock and Ives when I walked in. He looked up from his laptop, and the moment he saw my face, he stood up. You got them? I pulled the folded documents from my inner jacket pocket, the same pocket where I used to keep the leather notebook, and handed them over. Caden unfolded them gently, smoothing out the creases on the receptionist's desk. He ran his thumb over the raised seal on my mother's death certificate and let out a long, ragged exhale. Perfect, Caden said. This is exactly what we need. I'll start drafting the probate exhibits right now. Is the judge in? I asked. Caden nodded toward the hallway. He's expecting you. Jasper Locke was standing by the window of his office, looking out at the street. He turned when I walked in. He looked sharper today, more alert. We are on schedule for Thursday morning, 8 a.m., Locke said without preamble. Once the clerk stamps the petition, the protective trust shields the assets. Quill will get the automated electronic notification at approximately 8:15 a.m. There's a problem, I said. I sat down in the leather chair and told him about the lockbox. I told him about the vital records folder, and then I told him about the printed email. Locke didn't interrupt. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and laced his fingers together. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. A year and a half, Locke murmured. And she hasn't filed yet? She wanted to protect her annual bonuses, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. And now Thomas wants to have a private dinner with us tomorrow night, just the 3 of us. Locke leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Where? I don't know yet. A firm dinner, she called it, to move past the weekend. Locke let out a short, cynical bark of laughter. Thomas Quill does not host dinners to clear the air. He hosts dinners to close deals. He is going to ambush you. With what? A separation agreement, Locke said instantly. Think about it. He knows you have severe social anxiety. He knows you hate conflict. If they sit you down in a crowded, high-end restaurant, they know you'll be too paralyzed to cause a scene. Coralie will slide a pre-drafted agreement across the table, heavily favoring her, and Thomas will sit there acting as the benevolent, neutral mediator. They'll tell you it's just a temporary separation. They'll tell you signing it is the quietest, easiest way to get out of the room. I stared at him, feeling the blood drain from my face. It was exactly what they would do. It was exactly how I reacted to pressure in public. I would fold. I always folded. If you sign anything at all, before 8 lam Thursday, Locke continued, his voice deadly serious, you give her a documented, legal foothold into your assets. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. If she can prove you knew about this trust before the separation was finalized and failed to disclose it, she could tie the entire $9 million up in divorce court for 5 years. So, I just don't go, I said. I'll tell her I'm sick. No, Locke snapped. If you don't show up, they will know you're avoiding them. Quill's radar is already up because of the notebook. If you break pattern now, he might run a background check on you just to be safe. We need him completely blind until Thursday morning. You have to go to that dinner. I can't, I whispered. I'll panic. If they corner me in a restaurant, I won't be able to breathe. Locke stood up and walked around the desk. He stood over me, his presence suddenly overwhelming. You are Vita's son, he said, his voice dropping to a fierce, commanding register. Your mother walked into a boardroom full of corporate sharks every single day for 2 years, knowing they were stealing millions, and she smiled and poured their coffee and quietly copied their ledgers. She didn't panic, and neither will you. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy silver pen, and placed it on the desk between us. You go to that dinner, Locke instructed. You sit there. You let them talk. You let them hand you whatever document they have prepared. And when they hand you the pen, you look at it, you put it down, and you say you need 24 hours to have your own counsel review it. They won't accept that, I said, my voice trembling. They will have to, Locke said flatly. They cannot physically force your hand. The moment you ask for counsel, Thomas has to back off, or he risks an ethics violation that could cost him his license. Just hold the line until the check comes. Can you do that? I looked at the silver pen on the desk. I thought of my mother, exhausted, coughing in the kitchen, copying routing numbers into a tattered leather notebook. Yes, I said. Wednesday arrived like a slow-moving execution. Coralie texted me the address at noon, a notoriously expensive French restaurant in the Seaport district. At 4 p.m., I left work and walked to a mid-tier department store downtown. Coralie had demanded I wear a different suit. I found a young, bored-looking clerk named Stellan in the men's department. I didn't care about the cut or the brand. I just needed armor. I bought a dark navy suit off the rack, paid a rush fee for the in-house tailor to hem the pants, and put it on in the dressing room. I left my old charcoal suit in a shopping bag in the trunk of my car. When I got to the restaurant at 7 p.m., the maitre d' led me to a private, velvet-lined booth in the back corner of the dining room. It was dimly lit, smelling of roasted garlic, expensive wine, and old money. Thomas and Coralie were already there. They were sitting on the same side of the booth, leaving the single chair opposite them for me, a united front. Coralie was wearing a sleek white dress, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. Thomas was in a charcoal pinstripe suit, nursing a tumbler of bourbon. There he is, Thomas said smoothly as I approached the table. He didn't stand up. Take a seat. We took the liberty of ordering appetizers for the table. I sat down. The leather chair felt cold. I folded my hands in my lap, pressing my fingernails into my palms to ground myself. You look nice, Coralie said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, polite, distant. It was the voice she used when speaking to opposing counsel on the phone. The navy suits you. Thank you, I said softly. The waiter arrived, dropping plates of escargot and beef tartare in the center of the table. I didn't touch anything. I just stared at the ice melting in my water glass. For the first 20 minutes, Thomas drove the conversation. He talked about the firm's Q2 projections, a golf trip he'd taken to Pebble Beach, the ridiculous zoning laws in the South End. It was meant to disarm me. It was meant to make me feel small and out of my depth. Coralie nodded along, playing the perfect, attentive subordinate. Then, the waiter cleared the appetizer plates, and the trap snapped shut. Thomas placed his bourbon glass down on the thick white tablecloth. He folded his hands in front of him and leaned forward, his face shifting from jovial host to grave professional. So, Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave. Coralie and I had a very productive conversation this morning about her trajectory at the firm. She is poised to do great things. He looked at me, his eyes cold and dead, but she needs absolute stability to make this final push to partner. And unfortunately, the dynamic between the two of you has become a distraction. I didn't say anything. I just looked at Coralie. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was staring fixedly at the salt shaker. Coralie has expressed to me that things haven't been working for a long time, Thomas continued smoothly. And frankly, after observing the disruption on Saturday night, I understand why. She needs to separate her personal life from her professional obligations. Thomas reached down into the leather briefcase resting by his feet. He pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope and placed it squarely in the center of the table. Coralie has decided to initiate a trial separation, Thomas said. I am here strictly as a friend to her, and to ensure this transition is handled discreetly and respectfully. Inside this envelope is a standard, amicable separation agreement. It stipulates that you will vacate the apartment by Friday, and in exchange, Coralie will cover your first and last month's rent at a new location, plus a generous lump sum severance of $10,000 to help you get on your feet. $10,000 from the man who stole $9 million from my mother. Coralie finally looked up at me. Her expression was completely devoid of empathy. It was pure, calculated business. It's the best option for both of us, she said quietly. Just sign it, and we can all move on without any messy court proceedings. Thomas brought a notary from the office who is waiting at the bar. We can finalize it right now. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen and laid it carefully on top of the manila envelope. Take a minute to read it over, Thomas said, offering a tight, shark-like smile. But I assure you, it's exceedingly fair. I drafted it myself. I stared at the gold fountain pen resting on the manila envelope. It caught the dim light of the restaurant, gleaming against the stark white tablecloth. My chest was tight. The familiar, suffocating panic was right there, clawing at my throat, telling me to just pick up the pen, sign the paper, and make this incredibly uncomfortable moment end. It was what I had always done. It was what they were counting on. But then I felt the stiffness of the folded papers in my back pocket, the raised seal of my mother's death certificate pressing into my skin. I reached out. I didn't touch the pen. I picked up the manila envelope. I'll need 24 hours to have my own counsel review this, I said. My voice shook slightly, but the words were clear. The silence at the table was absolute. The background hum of clinking silverware and low conversation seemed to evaporate. Coralie's jaw dropped a fraction of an inch. Thomas's benevolent, shark-like smile vanished completely, replaced by a flat, cold stare. Excuse me? Thomas said softly. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said, forcing myself to look him in the eye. I'll have my attorney look it over tomorrow. Are you out of your mind? Coralie hissed, glancing nervously at the adjacent tables. She leaned across the table, her voice a venomous whisper. What attorney? You don't have an attorney. Stop embarrassing me and just sign the paper. It's $10,000. Thomas raised a single hand to silence her. He didn't break eye contact with me. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, the veneer of the polite mediator entirely gone. This offer expires when we leave this table, Thomas said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, silken register. mister. You walk out of here without signing, the 10,000 is gone. We file for a contested divorce first thing in the morning, and I will personally make sure my firm buries you in legal fees until you are living out of your car. You don't have the stomach for a fight, and you certainly don't have the capital. Sign the paper. They cannot physically force your hand. Locke's voice echoed in my head. I took a slow breath. I stood up. The leather booth made a loud squeaking sound, drawing a sharp look from a waiter passing by. I tucked the manila envelope under my arm. I'll be in touch tomorrow, I said. I turned and walked away. My legs felt like lead. Every step sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I half expected Thomas to stand up and grab my shoulder, to cause a scene, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not here, surrounded by the kind of wealthy clients he courted. I kept my eyes fixed on the exit, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and stepped out into the cool Boston air. I walked 3 blocks before my knees finally gave out. I leaned against a brick wall in an alleyway, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard it made my vision blur. I had actually done it. I had looked Thomas Quill in the face and told him no. I didn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't risk Coralie coming home and finding me there, couldn't risk the inevitable screaming match. I walked to the parking garage, got in my car, and drove to a cheap roadside motel in Somerville. I paid for a room in cash, locked the deadbolt, and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress in my new navy suit. My phone started buzzing at 8:45 p.m. You are an absolute idiot, Coralie texted. Thomas is furious. He's pulling the severance offer. If you think you're getting half my 401k because you suddenly grew a spine, you are delusional. Where are you? I turned the phone on silent and placed it face down on the nightstand. I sat in the dark for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to come up. Thursday morning, 8 a.m. That was the finish line. At 2:15 a.m., the screen of my phone lit up the dark room. I glanced over. It was another text from Coralie. Did you go into my office? My blood ran cold. I sat up, staring at the glowing screen. A minute later, another text came through. Where are your vital records? Why did you take your mother's death certificate out of the lockbox? I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I had been awkward in the hallway. I had stared at the wooden bowl. She had noticed. She had gone home from the disastrous dinner, angry and suspicious, and she had checked the one thing I had been hovering near. I didn't answer. I didn't type a single letter, but a terrible, sinking realization settled in my stomach. Coralie was ambitious, but she wasn't the threat. Thomas was. And if Coralie told Thomas that I had suddenly stolen my mother's death certificate less than a week after a retired federal judge showed intense interest in my mother's old notebook, Thomas was entirely too smart to miss the connection. I left the motel at 6 a.m. I drove straight to Brookline and parked down the street from Locke's brownstone. I sat in my car, watching the front door, waiting for someone to arrive. At 7:15 a.m., Caden walked up the street carrying a tray of coffees. I got out of the car and intercepted him on the sidewalk. He took one look at my face and stopped. What happened? He asked. Coralie noticed the documents were missing, I said, keeping my voice low. She texted me at 2 a.m. Caden swore softly under his breath. Did she say she was telling Quill? I don't know. I didn't answer. Caden unlocked the heavy oak door and practically shoved me inside. Judge Locke has been here since 5. Let's go. We rushed down the hallway to the back office. Locke was already sitting at his desk, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, reviewing a thick stack of printed motions. He looked up as we burst in. We have a leak, Caden said instantly. His wife noticed the missing certificates last night. Locke didn't flinch. He just set his pen down and looked at me. Did she confront you? Over text. I didn't reply, but Thomas was already threatening to bury me in legal fees because I refused to sign their separation agreement at dinner. If she tells him about the death certificate, he'll know. Locke finished grimly. He looked at the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. It was 7:22 a.m. The federal docket doesn't open for electronic filing until exactly 8. Caden, get the petition loaded into the portal. The absolute second the clock turns, you hit submit. Caden rushed to the small side desk, flipped open his laptop, and began typing frantically. Sit down, Locke told me, gesturing to the chair. Panic serves no one. If Quill connects the dots this morning, his first move won't be to call you. His first move will be to file an emergency injunction to freeze the Harrison Trust entirely, claiming the original whistleblower estate is illegitimate. Can he do that? I asked. He can try. It's a stalling tactic. He wants to force a drawn-out evidentiary hearing so he can bleed you dry before you ever see a dime. But if our petition hits the docket first, the protective trust shields the assets automatically. The burden of proof shifts to him. We sat in silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed deafening in the quiet office. Caden kept his eyes glued to his screen, his finger hovering over the mouse pad. 7:50 a.m., 7:55 a.m., 7:58 a.m. Portal is queued, Caden muttered, his voice tight, waiting for the server sync. 7:59 a.m. Locke leaned forward, his hands flat on the mahogany desk. I gripped the armrests of my chair, feeling my heart hammering in my throat. The clock struck 8. Filing now, Caden said. He clicked the mouse. A loading wheel spun on the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, Caden's face went completely pale. He leaned closer to the monitor, reading the text that had just popped up. Judge, Caden said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. It bounced. Locke stood up. What do you mean it bounced? Did you attach the exhibits correctly? The exhibits are fine, Caden said, turning the laptop so Locke could see the screen. The clerk's automated system rejected the petition. The Harrison Trust has been locked. Locked by who? I asked, looking between them. Locke read the screen, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. Quill, his firm filed an ex-parte emergency motion under seal at 6 a.m. this morning. They woke up a federal magistrate judge to get it stamped. How? I asked, the room suddenly spinning. How did he know? He didn't need to know everything, Locke said, pacing behind his desk. He just needed to know enough to get spooked. Coralie must have called him in the middle of the night about the certificates. Quill saw the threat, bypassed the standard docket, and used his firm's influence to freeze the board before we could even step up to the table. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It wasn't Coralie. It was an unknown number. I looked at Locke. He nodded once. I answered it and put it on speaker. Hello? I must admit, I underestimated you. Thomas Quill's voice echoed smoothly through the quiet office. He sounded perfectly calm, almost amused. I thought you were just a pathetic, anxious little man clinging to his wife's coattails. I didn't realize you were trying to play in the big leagues. What do you want, Thomas? I asked. I want you to understand your position, Thomas said. I know about the notebook. Coralie was very helpful this morning. She was quite distressed to learn you've been harboring stolen intellectual property from our firm. It's not your property, Locke said, leaning over the desk toward the phone. It belongs to the whistleblower's estate. And you know it, Quill. There was a brief pause on the line. Then, Thomas laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. Ah, Judge Locke, I wondered if you were foolish enough to actually take this on. You've been chasing ghosts for 20 years, but you're too late. The trust is frozen. My firm is filing a formal civil suit against your client at noon today for the theft of proprietary data, extortion, and fraud. You have no grounds, Locke snapped. I have unlimited resources, Thomas corrected effortlessly. By the time we're done with depositions, discovery, and appeals, you'll be dead, Judge, and your boy here will be bankrupt. But because I value efficiency, I'm willing to offer a settlement. We aren't settling, I said. Listen carefully, Thomas said, his voice hardening. Bring the notebook to my office at 3 o'clock today. Surrender the cipher. In exchange, I will drop the civil suit, I will expedite your divorce so you get out clean, and I will write you a personal check for $50,000. You take the money, you disappear, and you never speak of Harrison again. And if I don't, I ask. If you don't, Thomas said, I will ruin you. And I will start by having Coralie file a police report claiming you physically assaulted her last night in that motel room before you stole her lockbox keys. I stared at the phone. The sheer malice of it made my stomach turn. I could perfectly picture Coralie doing it, crying on command in a police precinct, sacrificing my entire life just to secure her corner office. Before I could panic, Judge Locke reached across the desk. He didn't look angry. He looked serene, the kind of absolute calm that only comes when a trap has perfectly snapped shut. He pressed a silver button on his desk console. A small red light blinked on. Counselor, Locke said, his voice cutting through the speakerphone like a scalpel. This is Judge Jasper Locke. You are currently on speakerphone in my chambers. With me is my clerk, Caden Ives. And, as of 2 minutes ago, this line is being recorded under standard arbitration protocols. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The background noise of Quill's office seemed to vanish. Furthermore, Locke continued smoothly. Vita's son was indeed at a motel last night. A motel in Somerville, where he paid in cash, was checked in by a front desk clerk, and was recorded on 3 separate security cameras. We also have time-stamped text messages from your associate Coralie, sent at 8:45 p.m. and 2:15 a.m., demanding to know his location. So, if she files a police report claiming an assault in a room she never entered, she will be committing perjury. And since you just explicitly directed her to do so in exchange for the surrender of evidence in a federal whistleblower claim, well, Thomas, I believe the DOJ calls that extortion, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I watched Caden cover his mouth, suppressing a shocked grin. I heard Quill exhale, a shaky, uneven breath. All the silken confidence was gone. He sounded exactly like what he was, a cornered animal who had just walked blindly into a snare. Judge, Quill started, his voice entirely different now. Small, pleading. You have exactly 10 minutes, Locke interrupted, his tone turning to absolute ice. You will call the magistrate judge. You will withdraw your ex parte motion with prejudice. You will dissolve the injunction on the Harrison Trust. If that docket isn't clear by 8:30 a.m., I am walking this recording directly to the United States Attorney's office, and I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary. Locke didn't wait for an answer. He reached out and ended the call. The office was dead silent. I looked at the grandfather clock. 8:17 a.m. We waited. No one spoke. Caden kept his eyes glued to the federal docket portal, his finger hovering over the refresh button. I sat in the leather chair, feeling the weight of the last 20 years pressing down on my chest. My mother hauling those banker's boxes, the medical bills, the way Coralie had looked at me at that gala, tossing the notebook onto the table like it was garbage. At 8:26 a.m., Caden gasped. It's gone, he said, his voice shaking. The injunction is lifted. The block is cleared. Locke looked at me. File it, he ordered. Caden clicked the mouse. The loading wheel spun for 2 seconds, and then a bright green confirmation banner flashed across the top of the screen. Petition accepted. Asset trust shield activated. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since Saturday night. I leaned forward and buried my face in my hands. I was crying, and I didn't care. $9 million. My mother's legacy, finally safe. Locke walked around the desk and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. Vita would be proud of you, he said quietly. You didn't fold. I spent the rest of the morning in Locke's office, signing the preliminary paperwork to establish the new estate accounts. By noon, it was done. The money was legally quarantined, entirely out of Quill's reach, and shielded from any marital claims Coralie might try to make. I drove back to the apartment at 2 in the afternoon. I needed to pack my things. I expected it to be empty, assuming Coralie would be at the firm doing damage control for Quill. But her car was in the garage. I walked into the apartment. Coralie was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes. She was wearing a loose sweatshirt, her hair a mess, her makeup smeared. She looked up when I walked in, and the absolute devastation on her face almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost, he fired me, she whispered, her voice hollow. Thomas called me into his office at 9 this morning. He said I was a catastrophic liability. He terminated my contract for cause, told security to pack my desk, and marched me out of the building. She looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. He threw me under the bus to save himself, and he said, you recorded him. I walked past her into our bedroom and pulled my suitcase from the closet. I did. She followed me to the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching me throw shirts and pants into the bag. The realization was slowly dawning on her, replacing her grief with a frantic, desperate calculation. How much is it? She asked, her voice trembling. Thomas wouldn't tell me. He just said you had the cipher. How much is the trust worth? I zipped up the suitcase and pulled it off the bed. I walked right up to her, forcing her to step back into the hallway. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel small. I just felt completely, finally free. It doesn't matter, I said calmly. You're getting exactly what you wanted, Coralie. We're getting a divorce. And you can keep the $10,000 Thomas offered me. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and walked toward the front door. You can't just leave, she screamed, her voice cracking in pure panic. I am your wife. I deserve half of whatever you're getting. I supported you. I paid for this apartment. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. I reached into the breast pocket of my new navy suit. The old leather notebook was there, safe and secure. I ran my thumb over the frayed edges, smelling the faint memory of vanilla coffee. You thought it was garbage, I said, without looking back at her. So it's garbage. Have a good life, Coralie. I opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and closed it quietly behind me.